Count Crowley's second collection is the Amateur Midnight Monster Hunter, released last year. It expands on many of the themes present in the first issue, while also expanding the scope. It allows Jerry to grow and develop as she takes steps toward dealing with her own addiction. The supernatural creatures are still at the forefront, but their use is more similar to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where they're metaphorical manifestations of everyday problems and societal issues. The writing and art are still very good, with improvements in both areas. While it relies on cliffhangers at the end of each issue, and even at the end of the collection, it still manages to deliver a satisfying story. It begins with a splash page from Vincent Van Gogh offering a recap of the previous events, and then jumping right where the last issue left off, with Stephen the Werewolf attending Jerry's AA meeting. Much of the first collection was focused on Jerry's addiction, how it affected those around her, and in general how selfish it made her. She put her own needs above others, willing to break laws and steal in order to get her own way. While that characterization doesn't completely disappear, and it shouldn't, here she focuses on Stephen's struggles and tries to help him. Initially she is more confrontational, but decides there are other ways to go about it and goes into research mode. The AA meetings are recurring events during this issue, as Jerry is going daily, being in the first week of her recovery. While AA is certainly not for everyone, for a lot of people it helps tremendously, having a new routine besides drinking, a sense of community, and things to work towards with the steps. While it seems like dealing with alcoholism is a more modern issue, AA originated in 1935, and meetings like this in the 80s were relatively common. The next scene depicts a group of capitalist vampires plotting ways to make more money, as well as deal with potential threats, including the letter with Count Crowley sprawled across it. This lets us know the vampires are not affected by sunlight, and it's later discussed they are effectively impossible to kill, although they can be incapacitated through removing the heart. They are not the only monster killed through a gruesome method, however, as Jerry discovers when she returns to Vincent for information. He says the only way to kill a werewolf is not silver bullets or brute force, but ripping out its tongue. Thematically, this refers to removing the voices of the disenfranchised, which is where the analogy comes in. While it's not a one-to-one comparison, the werewolf of fiction can be likened to the AIDS crisis. For those unaware, AIDS, caused by HIV, was an epidemic that began in the late 1970s and early 1980s, especially in the gay communities. It was a sexually transmitted disease, and information about it was limited. This was helped along by Ronald Reagan's administration, which treated the issue as a joke, offering no help until the last year of his presidency, and even then it was limited. There are a number of reasons behind this, but one of the largest is that it was seen as a gay plague and didn't affect the average American. In issue 3 of the collection, Vince recalls his previous experience with werewolves. He was part of a secret battalion dealing with supernatural threats during World War II. He describes, in loving detail, his fellow soldier Andy Bearer. It's clear they were more than friends, although he never quite comes out and says it. Andy gets bit by a werewolf because he let his guard down, or extending the metaphor, because he had unprotected sex. Vincent recalls after that point that there was no coming back, and just like with AIDS, there was no cure, no way to prevent what was coming. Of course, that was 40 years ago, and with modern medical or supernatural knowledge, it might be possible to actually save a werewolf from their ultimate fate, but Vincent is still stuck in the past, unable to move on from his trauma. It's likely Jerry is the only person he talked to about that experience. After he finishes his account, he cries a single tear, then sinks down, a dejected man. While Vincent is old, in every encounter he has shown a fiery temper and explosive energy. But after discussing the person who may have been his only true love, he is spent. He then says in German, "When will I see you again, old friend?" and "I miss you." While it's not the same kind of pain that Jerry deals with, they've both avoided answering the cause, and it's weighed them both down. Despite his rantings about how only men can be anointed, and other derisive comments about Jerry, he still tries to help her. He describes how vampires are demons, potentially hundreds of years old, and fairly bat-like, with super-hearing claws and fangs. The text depicts a montage of this new foe arriving at the airport, surveying some victims, and eventually chowing down on a cab driver. Also during these scenes, alcohol is featured prominently. Despite not being Jerry's viewpoint, there are still efforts made to show how ubiquitous the substance is. There's also the pun with drinking and driving can kill a friendship, with blood drinking and Jerry's experiences. She confronts her werewolf problem head-on, equipping herself with a hammer, chains, and a clipper, and determination to end things. She finds Stephen at his home, and he begs her to kill him. Despite everything, she sits down and listens to his story. Here the werewolf metaphor represents drug addiction rather than AIDS, but there's no reason it can't be two things. Crystal, Steven's girlfriend, first introduced him to drugs, and the doggy. She also killed his dad when he tried to put Steven into treatment, and while the actual violence is extreme, it's common for addicts to push away anyone trying to get them help. In this case it's even worse, as Crystal has taken efforts to isolate Steven, as she needs someone to do drugs with her, as having someone else along the ride helps her feel better about herself. Of course, with the impeccable timing of a narrative, as soon as Jerry badmouths Crystal, she arrives, with a notably large wound directly by her head. She's almost skeletal in appearance, clearly emaciated due to her drug use. She brawls with Jerry for a while, although our protagonist is ultimately successful, at least in the first round. Just before the reveal, there is another nice-looking panel of Steven, half-cast in an intense shadow. Throughout this collection, there is an effort to make the comic look more cinematic, with more dramatic shots and varied panels. Due to the 80s horror inspirations, this makes sense, and the comic feels more dynamic as a result. The next splash page continues this, and is the end of the first issue. The second picks up at that moment, and there is a well-executed chase and fight scene, showing off more of the improved style. Cracked frames are used to show the intensity of the conflict, with the slam of the door even disrupting the panel in a bit of a meta moment. There's another relic of the 80s in the exterior shot with a pair of lawn darts stuck in the grass. These caused many accidents, and while plastic ones are available, metal-tipped ones were banned in the United States in 1988. There's a particularly nice panel displaying Crystal perched on the roof of a car, and an enormous orange moon in the background. Steven attempts to stop the conflict, but is smacked down by the wolf. As he cowers on the floor, it's clear this is not the first time, and Crystal is not only verbally abusive towards him, but physically. Despite this, Steven still begs her to stop while saying he loves her. The werewolf in this case again represents something different, as now it's about abusive or toxic relationships. Crystal is a monster, but Steven still believes it's not the real her, that the outbursts or damage are not her fault, and that things can still change. Jerry, on the other hand, has experienced enough monsters to know that sometimes there is no helping them. This will come back later with Victor's experience. Steven still helps to restrain Crystal as Jerry chains her down and rips out her tongue, but his inner conflict makes the experience harrowing. Again, the art is a highlight as the frame where the actual violence happens is off screen, but the impact it has on the characters is shown, and works just as well as displaying the act itself. After they're done, Steven asks Jerry to kill him, and while that was her initial intention, she recognizes the difference between Steven and Crystal. Crystal enjoyed being the monster. She killed because it felt good, and she wanted to hurt people. Steven has done his best not to hurt anyone, and by going to AA, he's trying to fix his personal problems as well. Jerry also sees something of herself in him, as they're both struggling with addiction. When Steven says he's hopeless, and Jerry argues against it, on some level she has put her own journey onto him. If he can be cured, she can as well. The entire time she was at Steven's house, she was in charge, directing him about what to do and finding Crystal. Once she gets home, she is allowed to release those emotions, standing in the shower with a somber expression. The used alcohol bottles certainly aren't helping matters, but ultimately she is able to stay away. There's another fun bit of art here, with the cat leaping at the food. Similarly, the cat knocks the whiskey bottle down as soon as Jerry looks at it, apparently caring for her welfare. Jerry is given a task to retrieve the 5 sacred texts from Barnes' house. Amusingly enough, she's singing the Addams Family theme song as she drives there. She begins to clean, tidying up the booby traps and rotted pumpkins. This is a metaphor how she's taking charge of her own life, tidying up her own demons. The cat eventually guides her to the sacred texts, which are hidden by King Cujo for some reason. Just as she discovers them, the door rings, and surprise, it's a vampire, posing as a TV executive. Well, it appears that is his actual job, but hardly the point of his visit. There's a good bit of tension as Jerry has to lie her way through the conversation, with another panel with nice use of shadow. Similarly, Jerry's speech bubble is literally dripping with sarcasm, using all elements of the medium well. The issue ends with the vampire leaving, but offering a hint that he knows more than he let on. The next issue begins with an AA meeting, where Jerry is still struggling to share. She's trying to solve Steven's problems, rather than dealing with her own head-on. Her brother displays his usual level of tact by showing up outside her meeting, checking to make sure she's okay. This is a repeated occurrence by men in her life, who take actions thinking they know what's best for her, ignoring what she actually wants and needs. This goes back to the themes of the first collection, but will occur throughout the run. It's not only her brother, but Jimmy the cop, Victor, and Barnes. While she flies off in a rage at her brother, she directs that energy towards solving the werewolf problem. She heads to Victor, but he dismisses her again. Then we get his backstory, which explains some of the anger. While she can't decipher the text, she does find an image similar to that in the last collection, which offers her some hints about what to do. This is helpful, but while still dealing with the frustrations of her brother's prying, and the world in general, she goes to blow off some steam. Her traditional method of alcohol has been removed, so she has some casual sex. Unfortunately, Jimmy is creeping on her, at the command of her brother, again reinforcing the themes of males acting inappropriately, out of a sense of concern. She confronts her brother, but discovers the vampire again. The next issue opens up on that, and after a hurried conversation he leaves. She asks Victor for advice, and we're treated to a very similar structure to the first issue of the collection, which is a bit of a negative. Get the exposition, go to the store, acquire a weapon, then find monster. In this case, however, the monster finds her, trying the same trick we saw earlier in the cab. Jerry, however, has a lot more weapons readily available, and stabs the creature before retreating into the house. The vampire pins her against the wall, then tries his hypnotism trick. It doesn't work on Jerry because she is in fact appointed, although he tries for more obvious methods. Themes come into play again here, as a man is using his voice to literally control a woman, but due to her own will, it doesn't work. It wouldn't surprise me if there is a twist at some point that the appointed thing is just part of the rituals, and anyone could combat evil if they set their mind to it. In this case, however, Jerry asks for higher power to save her. This ties in with an earlier scene where she discussed what AA was about with another member, and how the higher power doesn't have to be a god, but it could be nature or science. In this case, the higher power was her belief in Stephen, which could be called faith. He rips out the vampire's heart, and Jerry is just delighted that she is appointed, that energy carrying her through an entire montage of her bearing the vampire's corpse. Stephen then shows up to her house unwolfy, and she vows to find some way to save him, as her being appointed means the text can be understood eventually. She heads off to a Count Crowley show, and then it seems like everything is going to work out, similar to the ending of the first volume. Unfortunately, that hope is rudely interrupted by Barnes, who has arrived back in town. He carries the same mindset as Victor, and has preemptively ripped out Stephen's tongue, killing him. It's a hell of a cliffhanger, and makes the volume a bit of a shaggy dog story, as Jerry's objective the entire time has been to deal with this moral problem, first to kill him, then to help him, and ultimately, a man showed up in her life and did the job for her, without any consultation. It's an incredibly effective ending, and while it invites a number of questions that aren't answers, it does so in a positive way. Overall, this collection improves on the first in most ways, with more dramatic and cinematic art, a more interesting plot, and strong thematic connections. The pacing is still a little bit off, but it's a minor complaint that is otherwise a stellar comic. I hope you've enjoyed this review. That's one more Count Crowley collection to go, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Thank you, and be well.